This is Robbie McKenzie, Youth Ministry 6.3. I have with me Dr. Kara Powell. She's written a number of books on youth ministry, about youth ministry culture. She's recently written a book that's interesting on entitled Sticky Faith.
Yep.
She's into, I notice you've written a lot on justice, deep justice. I guess it's in a broken world or something like that.
Yeah, exactly.
And so appreciate everything that you do. Something that interested me when I first started youth ministry back in 2004 was the good sex material that you, I guess, co-authored. And it's been crucial for my students. Now I'm on a second cycle. I noticed you had it's an updated version, I think, in 2009. Yeah. So that's kind of what we're going to be talking about today, is teenagers and sexuality. And so just the first question, really, and this is a broad question, I understand, but what kind of monster are we dealing with? We being teenagers, parents, youth ministers, when it comes to teenagers and sex culture?
Yeah, good question. And, you know, I think I appreciate you asking what kind of a monster are we dealing with. But and certainly the messages about sexuality have been distorted, perverted in culture. But really, at its core, God made sex.
Absolutely.
You know, and that's actually why we entitled the curriculum, Jim Hancock and myself, I think Jim came up with the idea, Good Sex, and then Good Sex 2.0, because you know, one of the really dangerous messages that the church has been communicating is that sex is somehow bad, displeasing to God, and that's not true. I mean, Absolutely. Think about how God designed male and females. I mean, anatomically, there's a purpose there.
Absolutely.
And so to my mom's chagrin, we named the course Sex. And, and having said that, though, I mean, certainly the messages in our culture are so different. I was listening to National Public Radio this past weekend, and they were talking about how, you know, Lucy and Desi Arnaz in I Love Lucy, they didn't sleep in the same bed.
Right.
You know, and compare that with what is normal and okay. It's on a regular network TV.
Absolutely.
It's on cable. And so I mean, at its core, sex is good, but our culture and our own sinfulness, honestly, has perverted it. And so that's why it's become the monster and the problem that it is instead of a real blessing.
Sure. And a monster could be, and I just thought about this, a monster could be that we're not really teaching right on sexuality.
Absolutely.
That's something that I'm hearing, at least from what you just said. I mean, that could be a monster. And then kind of maybe piggybacking on that, how do we have discussions with our teens? How do parents, youth ministers, have discussions with our teens about sexuality and have a good theology when it comes to sexuality?
Well, Robbie, you asked the question perfectly, because you said, how can I have a good discussion?
Right.
And that's really what it needs to be, is an honest, authentic discussion with kids. And
Absolutely.
Too many churches have stayed silent.
Yep.
Or barely whispered on the subject. And then at the other extreme are churches that yell and scream about it and shout themselves hoarse about it.
Sure.
And in that case, it's generally adults talking at kids.
Absolutely.
So the key is not to talk at kids, but to talk with kids. And that's actually why our curriculum is more questions than anything else.
Absolutely.
Because I'll tell you what helps me grow the most in my life is a dear friend, or anybody actually asking me a good question. And so the key is for us to ask questions that are honest, being direct without being pushy, and appropriate to the level of relationship we have with kids.
That's awesome. Speaking of extremes and not being too pushy and so forth, what are some things that you would avoid when it comes to discussions about sexuality and about things? When I say sexuality, I mean sexual stuff. It could be even sexuality itself, but anything sexual. What are some things that maybe pitfalls, things you have heard or at least experienced that you would avoid?
Yeah. Well, the number one thing I would avoid is leaving parents out of the mix.
Absolutely.
So, stated more positively, the best research, including research that we do here at the Fuller Youth Institute, shows consistently that parents are the most important factor in a kid's development. Their overall faith in life is more determined by their parents than anything else. I'm a volunteer small group leader at my church, love being around kids. I know you do, Robbie, and
Absolutely.
the people watching and listening do. And man, youth leaders, we have such an important role, but you know what? As a general case,
Sure.
we are not as important as parents. And so, how can we as leaders really bring parents into the discussion? And perhaps we invite parents to come to our, sexuality series. Perhaps we give materials for parents to talk about after we teach about sex, or have these discussions, or maybe even better, before we teach about sex. One of the curriculum that we use in our church for children's ministry actually invites parents to talk with their kids beforehand, which
wow.
I love that message because it communicates that the discussion, the growth starts at home and the church reinforces, versus it's starting at church and then the parents reinforce. So, that's the number one mistake that I see youth leaders making, is that they don't know how to involve parents. Maybe they're not parents themselves. And if that's you, if you're not a parent yourself, or if you don't know how, man, invite some parents to be a team with you. I mean, in general, for your whole ministry, but at the very least, when you're teaching on touchy subjects like this, so they can help you figure out, how do you best connect with the parents of your church or ministry? And how do you also equip parents to talk about things like homosexuality and oral sex and all those sorts of things that parents are tentative. Actually, interestingly, there's some research that indicates that Christian parents are actually less likely to talk about sex than non-Christian parents.
Wow.
And which is tragic, because we should be the ones who are most comfortable talking
Absolutely.
about kids. And so I think one of the best things we as youth leaders can do is give parents ideas on how to talk about their kids, keep them informed, so that the conversation about sex doesn't just happen at church or in small group, but also happens at the home. So
that's awesome. Speaking of ideas and giving them resources and so forth, what are some material other than the awesome Good Sex 2.0? What are some materials that youth ministers, parents, and even teenagers? I know some of my teenagers love reading, albeit on an iPad or a Kindle, But what are some materials that you would recommend that we could get our hands on?
Yeah, my friend and colleague, my good buddy Chap Clark here at Fuller, his book Hurt, and a new book, a revised version is coming out, Hurt 2.0. We're kind of into those 2.0 suffixes here at Fuller. Talking about the abandonment of kids, I think that's kind of one of the precursors to a lot of what's happening with sexuality, is that kids feel like the adults in their lives are so busy, and we are, and not as emotionally engaged, more selfish, not as nurturing or aware of what's going on with our kids. So the first time I read Hurt, I couldn't put it down. I think I read it in a day. I just kept flipping it, and so and that's been helpful for literally thousands of parents and leaders. So that's definitely the first and major resource that comes to mind. Another thing also is, this isn't necessarily books so much, but talking to others who can share their testimonies with your kids. I was just in Danville, California yesterday, in the Bay Area here in California, and we were talking about just the power of testimonies and sharing with kids. And so whatever your sexual journey has been like, you can share that, again, appropriate level of disclosure.
Sure.
That makes sense. But then invite somebody else whose story is really different than yours to also share with your kids, just as another resource, another mentor, or just somebody that those kids can think, oh, I remember what Susie said, or I remember what Juanita said, or Roberto said. So that's a powerful resource that we have, the resource of community.
Absolutely, and that's what it's about. It's about listening to other people's story and then inviting ourselves into the story and being kind of sojourners with each other on that, and that's super. Last question: say I'm a youth minister who just started his or her first job. I'm very wet behind the ears. I'm as they say down the south, I'm as green as they come.
Yeah.
And what bit of advice would you give me if I'm just now starting my first full-time ministry staff job?
Yeah. Wow, great question. A lot of things come to mind, but I think the number one thing that comes to mind, well, gosh, it's so hard to pick.
I know.
Can I pick two?
You can, absolutely.
Okay, great. I would say number one, never neglect your own spiritual life and self-care. I see a lot of leaders, and I myself have certainly done this some years and some weeks and some months, running around on empty and trying to pour out of empty. And my favorite passage in the Gospels is John 15. We had it read at our wedding, that as we abide in him, we will bear fruit. And so I would just invite us all, myself included, to make sure that we instill in our lives the practices, the habits that will help us stay connected with God. And my accountability partner, I've given her 4 questions, and one of them is exactly that. How am I doing at staying connected with God every day? So,
That's awesome.
So that's the first thing. And then the second thing is not only being connected with God, but finding a mentor. Find someone, and it might be a whole team of people. Maybe you can't find just one mentor, but you find different people who can mentor you in different ways, who can speak into your life, who can model for you what it's like to be a little bit ahead of the journey that you talked about, Robbie. And so find someone, ideally your same gender, but if not, that's okay too, who you can just, who will do what Paul describes in 1 Thessalonians, that I was delighted with you, not just to share the gospel, but to share my very life with you. And we all need that. And as we do that with kids, we need people doing that with us. So that would be the second recommendation I'd have.
That's awesome. This is Kara Powell. This has been Youth Ministries 6.3. 6.3 is Nehemiah 6:3. I'm doing a great work, and I cannot come down. Thank you so much, Kara. Hang on a little bit. This is lesson number 13. Thank you so much.
You bet. My pleasure. Thank you, Robbie.